Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Debbie Vini. I'm on staff at the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools. I lead our communications and marketing and also a couple of other things. My team runs a conference and I also do a bit of grassroots advocacy work. But I'm here today with two good friends and colleagues to share some numbers with us. And we're going to dig more deeply into some of the most recent polling data coming out of our sector that's related to education and school choice. In terms of voter priorities, education has generally kind of hovered around the mid-range of the top 10 ballot box issues for voters, and this has been consistently true for a really, really long time, but now it's becoming an even bigger issue with some voters, particularly parents. So our panelists today are going to tell you about what we're hearing from voters, and we're looking specifically at parents as a subsection of the voting population, and also at young parents, not super young, but millennials, so younger parents. And you're going to hear that some of the data shows where demand for charter schools and school choice is growing, and also why it's happening. Some of our more vocal opponents would have us believe that support for school choice is waning, but that is not true. The numbers are going to show you, and they do not lie. In fact, support for charter schools and school choice is quite alive and well and growing. And we're going to show you today that voters care a great deal about this issue, and that their support is in fact growing rather than shrinking. Now, our hope is that this information is something that you can take back with you, because my two partners here have gathered this information, and it has national relevance. These are things that you can feel comfortable and confident taking back into your local communities when you're influencing stakeholders that matter to you, or even when you're answering media queries. So I have with me today Brian Rich from Murmuration and Anna Genovker from the Harris Poll. And Brian and his team. Oh, okay, thank you so much.
Start all over again.
Well, I got into so much trouble as a young person for having the voice that was apparently distinct in the classroom. And so there would be 20, 25 children talking, and the teacher would always turn around and go, "Deborah Vini, I heard you." So I think I have tried to modify that over time and be less standing out, but glad you can hear me now. Anywho, so we've got Brian Rich from Murmuration and Anna Genovker from the Harris Poll. And Brian and his team of researchers regularly do these pulse checks and just want to talk with voters on a variety of issues and things that are related to education and school choice. So he has a really, I think, lovely perspective on this, because they do this every few months and have been doing so for a few years. And their most recent data shows a really interesting pattern around young voters in particular. And the team at Murmuration is also planning to release some new polling data later this week, and maybe if we are very, very, very nice to our friend Brian, he'll give us a sneak peek of what they have coming out, and we'll know before anyone else does. And speaking of sneak peeks, I'm thrilled to have Anna here, who is going to talk about the latest research from the Harris Poll. Now, the National Alliance commissioned the Harris Poll to do a research project with us. This was a follow-on to a project that we did. So my colleagues out front here on our research team at the Alliance also helped me to work through an analysis of what public school data looked like in terms of enrollment, specifically during the pandemic. So we looked at the first full year of enrollment data in both types of public schools, so district public schools and charter public schools. And we wanted to see, was there anything interesting happening there? I was starting to kind of anecdotally get a sense that maybe there was some growth in certain areas. And we came out of that with the understanding that 1.4 million children left their district schools during the first full year of the pandemic, and about 240,000 new students enrolled in charter schools during the same time period. Well, that is an interesting thing, huh? So the interesting part there is we knew what happened, but not why. We had no idea what the motivation was for parents who might have made this switch. It was also difficult to determine just from looking at the numbers, is this a fluke? Is this something that might continue? So this is why the National Alliance worked with Anna and her team of researchers at the Harris Poll to kind of dig into that a little bit more. So they surveyed 5,002 parents last month, and to get a better understanding of why, whether, and when parents might have switched the type of schools that their kids attend. And then they also explored some of the issues that are really most important to voters right now with respect to education. And we, of course, being the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools, we have a specific interest in charter school trends, and so we did do a little bit deeper there, but there's also some interesting patterns just generally across education. And we're looking at different demographic groups, and so we could look at party affiliation, racial breakdowns, geographic, and we were just really looking to see are there things that are happening in one place or another, or are they pretty consistent across the board? And Anna's going to share a sneak peek of one portion of this data. So we just got out of the field, and there's like a trove of information, so much so that it's going to take us at least another month or so to finish refining and digging through all of that and analyzing it. And we'll be putting out a full report later next month. But today, Anna's going to talk you through what we found that we're ready to give in a sneak peek today. And maybe if you watched Politico, you might have heard an idea of what some of that sneak peek stuff was, because we did have a nice piece there this morning, as well as in the 74 and in the Washington Examiner. But with that said, Brian and Anna, I've asked each of you to just talk a little bit about yourselves. I asked you to join me today because you bring polling data that is slightly different. So you didn't, weren't working in partnership with each other, but when taken together, I think there's really some interesting stuff that is kind of builds on it and is consistent across both of them. And so why don't we just have each one of you tell us a little bit about yourselves and about the organization and the polling that you're going to be discussing. Why don't we start with you, Anna?
Okay. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure, a true pleasure for me to be here today. And just a couple of things. I am a researcher, and I lead a team of researchers at the Harris Poll. And maybe a lot of you have heard about Harris Poll, but it was founded in 1963 by Lou Harris, who was a pollster to John F. Kennedy. And it is one of the longest running polls in the United States. What we do is we track social sentiment and motivations on a very wide range of different issues, including education. And it was a very, very interesting survey and very interesting collaboration and partnership process with Debbie and the team here. On top of this, I just want to say that I am myself a charter parent, and we had a wonderful experience at charter, so I'm a big supporter and lover of charter schools at heart. So again, I will try to be as neutral as possible today, and it was very, very interesting, to live through this experience myself and then to look at the data from this survey. So it was fascinating in a way.
Awesome. Thank you, Anna. And Brian, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and Murmuration and the data you're going to talk about?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me. Murmuration is focused on transforming the politics around K-12 public education. So we support partners all over the country who are working in their communities on electoral advocacy, organizing work, and we help them by providing tools, data, research, strategic insights, and actually two types of research. We have applied data science, so for those of you who are familiar with politics, Targeting is the name of the game. And so we are developing targeting models to help our partners identify who are the right people to target and what are the right messages that we should be reaching them with at the right time. We also do a lot of public opinion research to kind of look at the overall state of education politics, the trends, the things that would be useful for anyone who's trying to organize in their community or build support for their education activities. We've done a handful of polls over the last several months. We did the benchmark poll that Debbie mentioned, which was really sort of the first one after the pandemic was over, according to some people, to try and get a sense of what had changed about education politics over the past 2 years. We did a deep dive into Republican voters, and the one that we're releasing on Thursday is a pretty extensive exploration of Gen Z attitudes around education and the future of work, democracy, and sort of a number of related things in partnership with Walton. So happy to share any and all of those things, but there's a lot of very interesting stuff in there.
Awesome. Well, let's dig in. So, Anna, why don't we start with you? Why don't you talk us through the new stuff that we are releasing today? Oh, and by the way, did you know today is the day that we're releasing our brand new information. So you're not just coming to a panel to hear about it, but you're one of the very first people to be able to do a little bit of a deep dive with us.
Okay. I think that, again, it is very sneak peek and very initial findings, but it's really, there are a couple of things that really stood out. And one of them is that education voters may become the new swing voters. According to our survey, out of 5,002 parents that we surveyed, and this is a representative sample of the U.S. parents of school-age children, 82% said that they are willing to vote for someone outside of their political party if their education platform aligned with their views. And I think this is fascinating findings, with about 40% strongly agreeing with this statement, and that is an indication that things and forces are starting to change, and the education is becoming really not only just a personal issue, but it's becoming more of a political issue. It's not only a family issue, it's becoming a political issue, and it may move the needle in the coming elections. Yes, I can do more?
Yeah, you can do more.
Okay, I can do more.
Tell us more.
To support?
Tell us more.
To support that, education is really one of the key considerations for the coming elections, right? We asked our respondents if they have voted before in the federal elections, or if they are planning on voting in the federal elections as well as in the state elections. And if they do, or if they have done so, what are the top considerations for them when they vote? In the federal elections, education came fourth, right? After economy, after taxes, and after health care. But when it comes to local state elections, it is really at the top of the parents' minds, and it is sharing the top spot with economy and taxation. Also, 83% of our parents said that that education has become a much more important political issue for them than it used to be in the past. Okay?
Yes, awesome, thank you. Now, I know you guys have been watching, as I have, what has happened with a couple of gubernatorial races. I'm going to point you to Virginia, which certainly is an example of where education became the center point of that. Now, we can pick apart how people thought about education as an issue there, but clearly it was. And that is how Mr. Youngkin became governor, by specifically running on an education platform. And then you guys might remember a couple years ago in the Florida gubernatorial race, the Democrat, who was a black man and the more favored candidate, lost to DeSantis, and specifically on the education issue. And specifically, it is black women voters who actually voted for a Republican candidate on the issue of school choice in the state of Florida. So what we're seeing today is I think, a really interesting example of how those were not one-offs, that there's, quite possibly something to this. And as we go into midterms, we should really keep our eyes on that. I think there are a lot of parents who are voting home first, family first, and putting, their children above their party. And there's, I think, a lot of room for us as a sector to think about how we leverage that and make sure that people in our home states are aware of what the numbers really look like and who their backers are. So some of the folks that are, more vocal and, interest groups, they don't speak for the people, and the numbers are really clear on this. Now, Brian, I'm going to ask if you can walk us through some of your latest research.
Sure. So first, picking up on what Anna said, we also have seen significant rise in education as a priority political issue. For perspective, before the pandemic, education was lucky to rank 12th, maybe 15th as a priority voting issue among most people. It's now firmly in the top 3 or 4. And for what it's worth, the economy and healthcare are always 1 and 2, so I consider coming in third to be essentially coming in first, which is a really significant shift. Obviously, the reason that happened is because when the pandemic hit and schools were shuttered, parents got a much more direct view of what was happening in their schools, and they were not happy with what they saw. They were also not happy sort of continuously over the course of the pandemic with the response that elected officials or school officials in their communities were having. So we've also seen a rise in voters saying that they would be willing to hold their local elected officials or local school officials accountable for the poor decisions that they made around the pandemic. Now, fast forward to today, and the challenge is, of course, whether or not education as an issue will break through. For older voters, what we are seeing is that they are largely fixed in their views. So any debate about education and, this side is better than that side, or this policy is better than that policy, is probably unlikely. Among younger voters, though, under 40-year-old voters, there's a lot of openness to exploring any number of different educational issues and educational policies. And so we're really looking at it and saying that the under 40 voter set is where the big opportunity is, to some extent in this cycle, yes, but particularly in 2 years, 4 years, 6 years. By 2028, Gen Z and Millennials combined will be the largest eligible voter cohort in the history of the country. Right now, they are, I would argue, largely kind of undefined as education voters. They are open to being persuaded. That could, by the way, fall in the direction of misinformation and disinformation. We've seen a lot of misinformation and disinformation around education that really has kind of, penetrated maybe 25%, maybe a third of all voters, but it's sort of held there. So there's about a third of voters that we're seeing who believe almost anything that you tell them about what's happening in the classroom and what is or is not being taught. And we can go into details, obviously, but I think y'all know what I'm talking about. The question of whether or not that number starts to expand into the electorate more generally is really one that we're tracking closely, and what I would say is probably the big challenge for education champions and education advocates at the moment. I say that in part because one of the other things that we're doing is we're tracking a lot of the kind of anti-public education grassroots efforts that are happening right now. So Moms for Liberty, Parents Defending Education have seen significant growth over the last year or two. Moms for Liberty reported 85,000 members across 46 states, 37 of which came online in the last year. What we haven't seen yet is what are they going to do this cycle. They've largely been quiet. There are rumors of as many as 1,500 candidates for school board that have been recruited. There are, we obviously saw in the Virginia election the angry protests at school board meetings. That was all orchestrated through grassroots efforts, or nearly all sort of manufactured grassroots anger. And so there's a lot of kind of malleability, I would say, in the electorate at the moment, the under 40 electorate. And they're very susceptible to any argument that's being made to them at the moment, particularly when that's couched in the types of language that talk about equitable access to high quality education and things that have sort of become the commonplace in the language. And then the only other thing that I would just add, there's all sorts of interesting nuggets in here, is in the older-younger voter split between older, above 40 and under 40, and particularly among Republicans, Anna was saying that, you know, a large number of voters are willing to stray from their party to follow someone who agrees with them educationally. I haven't seen their numbers specifically. I would venture a guess that that is almost entirely under the age of probably at least 50. Anyone who's over the age of 50 in our Republican poll said very, very clearly that they were party first, party identity first, and policy second, including on issues around school choice and charters that they were self-identified as being very passionate about. Any whiff of the fact that the advocate for school choice or charters was a Democrat would be a turnoff to older Republicans. The reason that's notable is because older Republicans are the ones who vote right now. Millennials and Gen Z are starting to emerge as a significant part of the electorate, but they are not at present, which means this cycle and maybe 2 years from now, the majority of elections are going to be decided by the older Republicans, who are much more conservative, much more anti-equity and anti-public education. And so the younger set has to arrive, the cavalry has to arrive in order for the possibilities that we see, and I think we'll talk more about going forward, to be realized.
Yeah, and I think that the good news is that based on the results of our survey and very initial results, they are arriving. They are arriving because 40%, significantly more than in some other age groups, 40% of people who said strongly agreed that they are willing to vote outside of their party were people, younger parents under the age of 35. So they are the coming force, right? These younger people will become parents and they will be passionate about education in the years to come.
So we just need to wait this thing out and wait until, like, you know, the old people die and the millennials and the Gen Zs are going to fix all of our problems. Is this what I'm hearing?
I mean, so
No, but then we will not be around to see it.
It's funny. I've been in politics and digital politics for years and years and years, and over the past, say, 20 years, we have seen adoption of the internet continue to go up and up and up and up, and the only holdouts just stopped getting counted at some point was the sort of tactful way we used to say it. They just died. The last holdouts no longer were sort of part of the survey. Yes, to some extent that is true, although I would not understate the amount of damage that can be done to public education over the next 2 to 4 years by older, more conservative, anti-public education voters who are being ginned up by all sorts of misinformation and disinformation. You know, look, some of it is true. I mean, across the board, I think, you know, you will see people are overwhelmingly disappointed with the public education that their children are receiving. They're disappointed with, as I was saying, the response to the pandemic, and frankly, the continued response to the pandemic, because in the world of schools, it is still very much a topic of debate as to how schools are going to manage those things. But there are, you know, hundreds, if not thousands, of school board elections this year where we have candidates going as far to the right as members of QAnon, open unapologetic members of QAnon. Apologies to any QAnon members in the room, but I think that's a terrible idea to have those people elected to school boards and making decisions about what is right for our children's education, mostly because their philosophy is to just burn it all down. They don't think the public education adds value. They don't think that every child deserves equal access to high quality education, but they don't have alternative solutions to it. So in the next 2 to 4 years, the risk that we are facing before young voters show up with that energy and enthusiasm to, I would essentially say, rebuild public education in this country in a lot of ways. You could see budgets zeroed out. You could see curriculum policies put in place that significantly curtail what can be taught in the schools, and on and on and on and on by a relatively small but very vocal, very well-funded, and very organized, ultra-conservative, whatever's further out than MAGA and all of that kind of segment, of the political class. So I wouldn't sit on your hands and wait, but I think if we can kind of staunch the bleeding over the next 2 to 4 years, then we will get a wave of support from younger voters that will kind of naturally be more beneficial, or at least something that will be more responsive to the types of education politics that I suspect most of the people in this room would advocate for.
Well, I recently became old myself, and I am an outlier, obviously. I'm going to represent the old people who are open-minded and
I think
persuadable.
I'm very much with you.
So when we opened the conversation, I was talking about this report that we did last fall on enrollment. And so we know about where the charter kids went, but okay, that only accounts for 1.1 some million kids. Where'd the rest of them go? And I'm wondering if you were able to find any of that in the recent polling that you guys did for us.
Yeah. Actually, one of the areas of our survey was focusing specifically on understanding kind of what happened, right? Among, again, 5,002 parents that we surveyed, 27% said that their children have switched schools at some point, right? At this point, just overall. And it's interesting kind of to understand where they switched out from as a first step. 64% switched out of public district schools. 25% switched out of private schools. And 21% switched out of public charter schools. So where did they all go to? 26% went homeschooling, switched to homeschooling. 23% went to charter schools, and 16% went to public schools. But now let's look at the timing of it. And we asked respondents if they switched before the pandemic or after or during the pandemic. And very interesting data coming out. Before the pandemic, switching to charter school was by far the most common switch out of any school, not only out of public district school, but it was the most common switch. Actually, yes, it was the most common switch from public school to charter, public district school to charter school, 27%. Then 18%, the next most common switch, was to homeschooling, and 17% switched to private schools. But during the pandemic, or any time after March 2020, 29% went homeschooling, and 14% switched to charter schools, and 12% switched to private schools. Again, I am just a researcher, and I'm completely independent and neutral, but I think the numbers don't lie. And what is very interesting to me as a researcher is that before the pandemic, anything that happened before the pandemic, and the switch was was more of a deliberate, right? A well thought through and well reasoned switch. The parents, children wanted something better, wanted a different choice, and they switched to charter. During the pandemic, we're seeing a big switch to homeschooling, which to me was more of kind of impulse, more of an emergency thing, and people, for many different reasons, decided to keep children at home, right? But again, the 27% before the pandemic switching to charter school is really a testament of, really strong belief that charter offers better educational option. Okay?
All right, thank you. Yeah, that's some good information. Okay, Brian, I'm gonna jump over to you for a minute. So we started the conversation talking about how the education voter just might be the new swing voter. I think that's pretty catchy headline and very interesting.
Maybe.
Might be.
Might be.
Anna's kicking me under the table. I can't say anything declarative,
No.
but they
But might.
just might be the new swing voter. Now, I'm going to ask you, what do you think about that possible, not declarative, but possible hypothesis? And is that bearing out with any of your data as well?
Yeah. So I think when the pandemic was at its peak, it was not surprising at all to see education as one of, if not the top issue that the vast majority of voters, not just parents, were concerned about. I think we hypothesized that as the pandemic waned and sort of the ever-present challenges around schools started to decrease, that education would fall back into its low double digits kind of rank priority, and it hasn't, which suggests to me that something has changed forever, right? That the electorate has been rewired, that parent voters that education voters are most likely going to become the swing voters.
Could be,
right? I can say it's not my poll. I can say it. The two things that I do think need to be figured out, though, as a part of that, are what is it that we want education voters to do? Even within the education community, within our universe of partners, there are many different policies and programmatic solutions that are put forward in front of voters. I can tell you from all of our both quantitative and qualitative research that most voters not only don't understand any of those various solutions, but they're not that interested in the heavy, wonky, technocratic conversations. What we hear from parents all the time is that mental health is a significantly important issue, and not in a we should advance social emotional learning type of perspective, but in an I am afraid to send my child to school and that they won't come home standpoint. And for those of you who are parents in the room, I have a 14-year-old and a 12-year-old. That is, you're not going to get past that fear because of some, programmatic explanation that a political leader or an education advocate offers. So we have work to do as an education community to figure out, what is it that these education voters actually want? Is it just choice? Is it nuance within choice? Is it improvements to district public schools, which there's a prevailing political theory out there that these people who fled to charter schools and to home schools will return if district public education can prove that it has sort of righted the ship. I don't think that'll happen that quickly, but it's good from a political standpoint.
Anna might have some numbers on that.
The other thing I just want to say that we have to figure out is we do have to figure out still how to actually motivate these voters to turn out. So in a federal year, in a midterm year, or certainly in a presidential year, everybody turns out. Anybody who's out there who thinks that their GOTV operation is the difference maker in a presidential year, good for you, but that's not actually true. People were going to turn out anyways. But when you look at school board elections in off years, and you look at single-digit turnout, and you look at races that are 1,500 voters and decided by, enough that you can count on one or two hands, there's significant both risk and opportunity there if we can figure out how to turn out more of these education voters. So right now everyone's interested, but they're not showing up. We have to make that leap in order for these swing voters to actually swing the elections in the direction that we want, because I assure you, if we don't, and I mean that as those who are pro-public education and who are championing things like charters, if we don't do that, then the anti-public education, anti-equity forces absolutely will. And we have already seen it. We saw it in New Hampshire. There was an out in New Hampshire, but in New Hampshire, one person basically got a school budget in a small town zero funded. Like the entire education budget got crossed out. The whole town rallied a month later to put that money back, but that was only because that was probably too extreme of an attack on public education, and it kind of freaked everyone out. But we have seen plenty of kind of chipping away at the foundation of public education work coming from the far, far right that is not being pushed back on by these swing voters who are predisposed to be supportive.
Yeah, and actually it's 42% of independent voters who strongly agree that they would be voting outside of their, we have indication, direct indication in the data that those 42% undecided independent voters will decide on their ballot based on may very well decide based on their educational platform of their candidates.
So you do a lot of these research projects all the time. It's what you do for a living. It is not what I do for a living. I might be more easily amused or entertained than you are by numbers. And so I'm wondering, when you did this project, was there anything that stood out to you as particularly surprising? Now, personally, I was blown away by the 82% of voters that were willing to vote outside their political party. And, but I'm wondering, was that shocking to you, or were there other things? And another question I'm going to ask you. Within that 82%, how was that split across political ideologies? I heard you talk about independence, but what that look like? So what was surprising, and what didn't surprise?
Yes, I will answer first what's surprising, and then come back and look at some numbers. I think, yes, the importance of education overall, if I look at the entire very big database as a result of this survey, I think the biggest takeaway was really the importance of education. The importance of education, and the importance of education as a political issue. And we talked and I shared a few numbers. And I think another kind of thing that I was really blown away is really the extent and the depth of the positive experience that charter school parents reported and shared in this survey. Just to, again, because numbers don't lie, and they really kind of reaffirmed what I always felt. 91% of our respondents said, or our parents said, that they are satisfied with the quality of the education that their children receiving at charter schools. And 91%, the same proportion, said that switching their children to charter school resulted in a positive change and a positive experience for them. Also, very interesting.
Now that sounds high to me.
Yes, it is very, very high. It's very high percentages. Again, this is among those people who
did the switch to
who did the switch. Yes, but more than that. Around 3 in 4 parents who switched to charter schools said that they have seen a favorable kind of a positive change in their children, in their school experience, and 53% said that it was a strongly positive change in experience. So I think, yes, all of this points out to a wonderful job that apparently charter schools are doing. But let's look at the moment outside of the charter parents community. We have 31% of parents who have children in district schools who said that they have a favorable, in general, they have a favorable opinion of charter schools. We have 40% of parents who have children in private schools who said the same thing. They either have a favorable or highly favorable opinion of charter schools.
That is interesting.
Okay, so it is more, we don't want to be very, very kind of lopsided or, very, look only at the charter school experience, but it feels from the results of the survey, and when you look at the data, that there is a positive, favorable opinion in the air about the charter schools.
Okay.
Well, and just by comparison, I think about 7% in our latest survey have a positive view of district public education
Ouch.
and think that it does a good job. So
We
it's
didn't-
fairly low.
We didn't ask this question.
That's
Wow.
Because again, the survey, I think we were focusing more on the charter schools. That's why,
Wow. I want to leave you guys some time to ask questions because I suspect that you probably do want to do some engagement. I'm going to ask one more and then I'll open up the floor for questions. And in case you don't have any, I do have more of my own. But so I came into this process, this project with you and your team with a hypothesis that the pandemic had created interest from a different demographic of parents. So speaking plainly, Black, Latino, and low-income families were very early adopters to charter schools. They knew that they weren't being well served by the schools that they were being zoned to. And so they were like really, really delighted to have another public school option that served their kids well. And I had a theory going into this that during the pandemic, when everybody was up close and personal with their kids and watching what they were learning during the day, that we saw some more affluent parents, maybe more white parents, maybe more rural parents, that also got interested in this. And was my hypothesis right or wrong, and what did the data tell us?
I think we need to do more analysis and need to do more kind of profiling in order to understand, because we have so many parents and we have so many different audiences and different sub-audience and subgroups within these 5,002 parents, right? And it will take us some time to look at different people, charter school parents, private school parents, because all of them have their own profile and have their own persona in a way. But I think by taking an initial look at who the charter school parents are versus some other school parents, there are not that many kind of demographic differences, but I think it's worth noting that in terms of all parents, if you look at all charter school parents, 25% are Hispanics, 41% are white, 19% are Black parents, and 8% are Asian parents, which, again, if you look at this in aggregate, 59% of the charter school parents are parents of color.
Yes.
Right? Versus 41%. Also, it's an interesting urban, suburban, rural breakdown. 36% are urban, live in urban areas, 53% live in suburbia, and 11% live in rural area.
Wow, that's surprising to me. I would have thought that the rural number would have been higher.
Yes.
I mean that the urban number would have been higher. Yes.
When you look at switchers,
Yes.
the urban numbers are higher.
Okay.
When you switch, but if you look at them in total,
Okay.
and again, that's why we need to look more. But I think that also the charter school parents tend to be slightly more democratic. There are more Democrats in the charter school parents population. Okay?
Interesting. Okay, y'all heard that. There are more
Yeah.
Democratic parents with kids in charter schools. Huh?
Yeah, if you look at the charter school parents, there are slightly more Democrats than in private school composition of private school parents
Got it.
and public district school parents.
Interesting.
I
So
need to-
elected officials who are not paying attention to their Democratic
Yeah.
constituency that are more highly represented in charter schools? Oh,
Yes.
Okay, is that
More
right?
represented.
More
Let's
represented. More
highlight-
represented,
yes,
okay.
More represented. More represented.
Then they would be out of step with their constituency
Yeah.
in that case. Okay.
Yes, but overall, in terms of this is demographics. In terms of the psychographics, I think charter school parents, overall, you get a sense from many different data points in the survey. They are more involved, right? They are more pro-choice for education, right? They are more vocal about the importance of having a choice for their children education. They're more vocal about being involved and wishing best for their kids. Okay?
Okay. I'm going to open the floor up now if folks would like to ask any questions of our research friends. Yes.
In the meeting session, you talked about the elections in Virginia and Florida.
Uh-huh.
From a governor standpoint. When we look at this earlier this year in terms of the recall in San Francisco, for example, the school board members, you talked a little bit about the thousands of elections potentially and some of the QAnon or other far-right representatives there. How do you have any personal takes on what happened in San Francisco as it relates nationally in that context at all? Or
Yeah.
otherwise?
Do you want to take that one? Okay.
Sure. So I think two relevant thoughts come out of San Francisco.
Oh, yeah,
Sure.
so the question is, we began talking about some shifts the gubernatorial races in Florida and Virginia earlier. And now we have a question from the floor about the recent recalls of school board members in San Francisco. And the question is, what did we think was the impetus behind that and what did it mean?
So two thoughts coming out of that. One is that I don't think that the results of the recall in San Francisco are necessarily representative of what we would see nationally. That school board was just sort of astonishingly out of touch with the local electorate, to the point that while the pandemic was raging, their primary focus of debate was on naming and renaming of schools. And they were sort of warned and warned again, and they continued on the path of just not taking on the issues that parents very clearly said were important. I think you would be hard-pressed to find a school board that was that bad elsewhere in the country. I mean, I'm sure they exist, but not that many. What was notable in San Francisco, though, was that the turnout was extremely high. Something like 72% of eligible voters turned out in that race. For a school board race and for a recall, that's a very, very high number. And what it suggests is that that education is not just considered a priority issue by these parents, but it is in fact a motivating issue for people to vote. If that holds true, then the challenges that we have faced in down ballot races where voters tend not to pay as much attention and funny things can happen, hopefully will not be true, and that we will have much more voter turnout, and it will allow for a more constructive political conversation about what we want out of education.
Yes.
Thank you for the presentation. Very helpful. One data point that piqued my interest was a piece about New Hampshire and defunding education. Sounded remarkably similar to like defunding the police. My father's a retired police officer, so I don't subscribe to that. But it's just very interesting. I didn't even know about that. But the backlash to defunding education hasn't been as hard as the backlash against defunding the police. And what's that all about? That's my question.
I mean, look, one, I think whether they have shown it or not historically through voting, people put tremendous value on education. If you are a parent, your hopes for your child are tied to education, and that will inform the way that you think politically. If you are not a parent, or if your kids are grown and out in the real world, you understand that high quality schools benefit you economically and socially, and that schools are the center of the community. What I think we are seeing politically, from both, by the way, extremes on the right and the left, are sort of overreach politically. So the idea of banning all of something or zero funding all of something, that spooks anyone, any voter, parent or not, compared to, whether you're a parent or not. But what I suspect is had, we seen someone go and say, we're going to remove all funding for social, emotional, and extracurricular activities because schools should only be teaching the 3 R's and, et cetera, I don't think anybody would have gotten off their couch to oppose that. And that, to me, is what's very dangerous about kind of the political environment around education right now, is there are a lot of very insidious policies being promoted, and by the way, passed in legislatures all over the country with no opposition because of, majority rule in both the House, Senate, and the governorship, that are not raising flags for voters. And those things, it's much harder to reverse that type of policy than it is ultimately to get it passed the first time. So, I think it's great to some extent if, ultra-conservatives come in guns blazing and say, defund this and shut down this and, all teachers are pedophiles and, all of these things that are just like outrageous because people start to go, whoa, maybe there's something, problematic here and I do need to turn out, I do need to involve myself, I do need to get there. But the very smart politicians, the governor of Florida being a perfect example, are couching a lot of these very extreme policies in very standardized, historically democratic political language. And people are going, it's not that big a deal. It's not a problem. In fact, we did a focus group, several focus groups, a year and a half ago now. And it was only when we presented the option that the same people who were protesting at school boards were the ones who led the insurrection at the Capitol that that voters started to say, well, that could be problematic. Everything else was, people are going to be loud, that person's crazy, they're not representative of everyone else. It was all, there were excuse after excuse after excuse until sort of the downfall of our democracy was the consequence of attacking public education in this country, that people started to say, oh, well, maybe that line is too much, to cross. So we have some interesting political debates over the next, certainly this cycle and in the next 2 to 3 cycles, to see whether or not voters will stand up to, to these very dangerous things.
Thanks, Brian. We have another question over here.
Yes, you referenced that by 2028, Generation Z and Millennials will be the largest combined voting bloc in the country's history. And then you followed that up with thinking about I guess, the malleability of their beliefs. About a third of them referenced basically will believe whatever they're told. So what my question is,
Yep.
It's like that group of people or voters, how should we be messaging those people and targeting them?
So 2 things. One, to be clear, about a third of all voters right now, predominantly over 40, are buying into
Whatever
all
they're
of
being
the,
told.
Yeah, whatever they're being told. All of the misinformation, disinformation-based arguments around education. That has not penetrated the under 40 set yet, but they are susceptible to it, so there's a possibility that it will go there. Debbie referenced research that we are going to release later this week. Our study coming out later this week is all about Gen Z and young millennials and where they are on issues of education and elsewhere, and what we need to do. The 2 nuggets that I would say is, 1, the culture war stuff does not work on the under 40 set at all. They're not interested in it. What they are interested in is serious discussions about big changes, right? They want dramatic improvements in public education in this country. They want sensible, not just like sensible on the margins gun laws, like they want weapons of war off the street and they're not going to compromise until it happens. And they're quite passionate about that and they're willing to show up and they're willing to put in the work to do that. So big substantive policy changes are very important. The other thing is, as I said, mental health is of significant concern. It is also an issue that under 40 voters, young people in general, are dealing with personally and are more concerned about their own personal mental health and the mental health of their friends and their family than any other issue out there. So if we want Gen Z to show up and be a political force, we have to help them deal with their own issues first, because they are going to take care of themselves and make sure that they are healthy before they go and try to solve society's problems. They have seen generations before them, including their parents, exhaust themselves fighting for these changes, not getting them, and being, broken and frustrated later in their lives. They said, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me, whatever the saying is. They're going to take care of themselves, and so we need to help them get the mental health and other supports that they need, which our schools are not providing per them, which our institutions are not listening to them and the needs for per them. And until we do that, they're going to sit on the sidelines, and they're going to have strong opinions but not necessarily act on them.
Yes. Yes.
Nope.
You.
Yeah.
Okay.
A state that's fairly pro-public education, Massachusetts,
Uh-huh.
but they're also fairly hostile to charter schools and stuff. So I find that maybe this is an uninformed view. There's this interesting alliance between those who are pro-charter, but those on the far right because they're pro-choice. Let's just choose who to come.
I actually would like to jump in on that one. Okay. This has been confounding to me. So some earlier research that the Alliance commissioned was specifically on the issue of the white progressive. The white progressive is a most interesting animal. And what we were finding is the white progressive was the least favorable on charter school issues. And but at the same time, they had like Black Lives Matter signs in their front yard. And they were talking about how love is love and science is real. And, they're volunteering at the SPCA, and they got like an adopted child in Kenya that they're sending a check to every month. And so I'm trying to understand, how is this group of folk not aligned with us on charter schools? I mean, this is how you make a difference for a population that you say you care about. This is the way to work through equity issues. Okay, so here's what I found out. They are confused. They are very, very confused. So there are layers of this confusion. The gateway to the confusion is because they think that charter schools are private schools. That's the number one problem. If we can get them to not believe that, then we can get a lot of other things done. But it starts with one, really literally, more than 50% of them do not think that charter schools are public schools. Problem number two, they believe that there's some kind of a crazy reverse Robin Hood scheme happening where we are doing something like, I'm going to use some neighborhoods I think we've all heard of, so I'm just going to say like Compton. We know where that is, and we heard of Beverly Hills. And so the white progressives think that people are actually going into Compton and taking money out of those schools and putting it into a Beverly Hills school for the benefit of affluent white children. I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't read the journal entries myself. But this is literally where our problem lies. And, we've been doing a lot of messaging work, specifically targeting the white progressive with things that we know are persuasive and understanding better who they are. Now, first of all, women are the persuadable, movable ones. Men just lost cause. Don't even waste your time. But you get women, and if you can get them around some shared messaging, and I like to think of it as like this values alignment type of work. So we know that they care about all the things I mentioned earlier, right? They care about equity, they care about fairness, and if you start there and then show them that charter schools, in fact, are a mechanism to support what they already believe in, it is incredibly effective. We did some polling in Los Angeles that blew my socks off. So we had been running this ad campaign, and it's called If You Believe, in Los Angeles. And we ran this campaign for about 6 months. We did some testing about midway through the campaign, we moved voter sentiment amongst white progressives on charter schools upwards of 30 percentage points just with that campaign. And it was just telling them things that they did not know. Charter schools overwhelmingly serve Black and brown and low-income kids. Charter schools are always public schools. And we ended it with this frame of like an adorable little child saying, if you believe in me, because we're like all this time, if you believe in this, if you believe in that, if you believe that a good education is important, then we got a little kid, and she's like, if you believe in me, support my public school, a charter school. And that stuff works, but we've got to do more of it, and we've got to do it consistently. I know we are at time. This has been a really great session. If I can leave you with one thing to think about, the numbers really don't lie, and I would encourage all of us, when we're out doing our work, lean into the things lean into the work where you can make a difference. We like to sometimes think of ourselves all as little snowflakes, and our communities are all different. They're really not that different. And the message points that work are the message points that work. The data that you're seeing is statistically valid and significant across the entire country. Remember, our biggest problem is they don't know that we're public schools. So we like to talk about how we're high quality. They already know that. Nobody's fighting you on that. Want to talk about how they're smaller schools? Yep, they got that. And they think they're small private schools. So make sure that you are really drilling down on the points that matter and are persuasive. Thank you guys so much for being with us today. Thank our panelists.